Welcome. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Virginia Comolli, Senior Fellow for Conflict, Security and Development here at IISS. It's a pleasure to see so many people joining us today, and I think that's testament to the timeliness of the topic that we are going to discuss today. I'm particularly excited to be chairing this event, well, for two reasons. One, I think, is it is indeed a very pressing topic. We spend so much time within these walls talking about tanks and missiles and terrorists and whatnot, but what really concerns me is climate change, really, and the impact that it has on so many facets of our lives, including security. And the second reason I'm very happy to be chairing this event is because I have the pleasure of welcoming a long-standing friend of the Institute, Professor Anatol Lieven, even a former colleague of ours at some point. Anatol is currently a professor at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, based in Qatar, and also a member of a number of think tanks. He has, in a previous life, experience in journalism, but he has spent a number of years in academia working on, a number of issues related to Pakistan, Afghanistan, former Soviet Union, and Russia. So we are very pleased that he has joined us today to discuss the research that has gone into a book that he has recently published, and also the content of an upcoming survival article that you'll see in the next issue that really discusses this issue of climate change and the nation state. So Anatol will speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks to the IISS. Thank you all for coming. And thanks also to somebody who unfortunately can't be here because he's ill, Dana
Yes.
Allen, who arranged all this and is, of course, also publishing my article. It would seem likely in a IISS audience that there are a number of either serving or retired members of the armed forces in the audience. If so, I would be particularly interested in your response to this talk, because the talk itself and the book is largely directed at the military, not just the British military to some extent, nor even Western militaries, but militaries in general. Above all, because of the role that they can play in alerting national populations to the threat of climate change, to climate change as a national security threat, and mobilizing state action in response, but state action supported and legitimized by the mass public. But it's also because a leading theme of this book is the link between patriotism, although I use the word nationalism because, frankly, I find the distinction meaningless. You know the old thing, I'm a patriot, you, if I don't like you very much, are a nationalist, and somebody over there is a chauvinist. I mean, in fact, the way in which in the West we use patriotism is in effect the same as what in other countries is called civic nationalism. In India, for example, Nehruite nationalism, and so on. So I call it nationalism. And a large part of the book is about the link, or potential link, between nationalism and sacrifice, and getting populations to accept painful changes for the sake of the national interest and even, in the long run, the survival of the nation. And I believe that in the military one can still talk about these things, whereas, believe me, considerable experience by now, in wide environmentalist circles, if you talk about patriotism, you are, if not actually a fascist, probably the next best thing. If you talk about resilience, you're undoubtedly representing some kind of patriarchal values, and of course the very idea of sacrifice, collective sacrifice, is profoundly alien to much of our contemporary culture. Whereas in the armed forces one can, I think, still talk about these things. Now, to begin with the public role of militaries and security establishments in defining national security threats and interests, I have been greatly influenced in my views by the work of somebody who I'm sure has spoken certainly in this institute, because that's where I met him, possibly in this room, Professor Barry Buzan and the Copenhagen School of Security Studies, who are, I can't remember whether they invented the term or whether they became the most famous exponents of it, the idea of securitization, that is to say, applying the idea of national security to non-military threats, or not strictly speaking military threats. And also by their idea of what they called speech acts, which is to say the declaration of something as a national security issue or as a threat to vital national interests by what they call authoritative or legitimate actors. In other words, people who are recognized by the public as having in some way the right to talk about and define these issues. Now, their writing dates back to the end of the 1980s and the end of the Cold War, when it seemed for a while not merely that there were other issues on the agenda, but that the conventional military and security issues were disappearing altogether. That has, of course, turned out not to be the case in the post-Cold War era, or whatever we're going to talk about. But when they did talk about climate change as a security threat, they talked about it, if you go back and read their works of the time, only as one among a range of environmental threats and issues. Now, I think it's pretty clear that in the intervening, generation since then, climate change has emerged not as an threat, but as the threat in environmental terms, but also, I would argue, in many ways, more widely as well. And that is not just because of the massive direct impacts and dangers presented by climate change, but also because, as has been widely remarked, the role of climate change as a kind of, what's the phrase, force multiplier, but the way in which it feeds into a range of other issues, from food shortages and their impact on societies, to potential conflicts between states over water, and of course into the issue of migration, the effects of which on Western political orders we have already seen, or if not migration itself, certainly the reaction against it. And of course, as we are experiencing at the moment, but I fear we ain't seen nothing yet, one of the generally made predictions about the effects of climate change will be to spread tropical diseases northward. And we are experiencing, of course, at this moment, the potential of disease, something which when I was a kid we thought we had banished forever. Not just, of course, to kill people, but also to cause massive economic disruption and potentially to delegitimize governments and states. This is obviously something which is very much in the mind of the Chinese today. In China, one's talking about the legitimacy of the entire communist state, but of course Western governments are beginning to worry very much as well how far their popularity and prestige will depend on how much they manage the coronavirus crisis. Now, in the long run, and I have to say, in what I'm saying here, I'm not going to discuss the scientific evidence, partly because I'm not a scientist, but also because, as far as I can see, the scientific consensus on this is now so solid that in any other area of scientific analysis, we would not even be discussing it. We would simply say, yeah, sure. The Earth goes around the sun and not the other way around. All our instincts say, of course, that the sun goes around the Earth. That's what, the world is made up of shifting tectonic plates. That's completely against all our instincts. And I personally wish it was not so, because if it wasn't, we could believe that there was an earthquake god or goddess who we could propitiate with offerings of flowers or possibly babies or whatever he or she likes. Whereas not much we can do about the Earth's tectonic plates moving around. We accept the scientific consensus. I think we need to on the subject of climate change. Incidentally, on that score, one of the contributions that military and security thinking can make to this is a correct assessment of risk. Because if not the climate change outright deniers, certainly those who would wish to delay or limit rapid action against it, have a way of demanding absolute certainty in the specific predictions concerning dates, specific dates and impacts. Well, of course, one applies that to the world of security studies. You would have to wait until it was certain that terrorists gained access to weapons of mass destruction before you would take action to prevent that happening. You would wait until it was absolutely certain that Russia was going to invade the Baltic states before you would take measures to deter that. So, in the world of security studies, we are used to a different way, and in my view, a much more appropriate way of looking at risk. Now, if you look at the scientific predictions, in the long term, of course we don't know, we cannot put in any way an exact time on this, but if we cannot keep temperature rises within certain limits, and if the rise in temperatures turns into runaway climate change, feedback loops whereby 3 degrees turns into 4 degrees, the release of methane in the Arctic, the melting of the ice caps, then leads to still further degrees in temperature, then there is no doubt whatsoever that we are potentially looking at something that can destroy civilization. If one's looking at a return of the world to the climate of hundreds of millions of years ago, then unless this is spaced out over a very long period, there is no way that any human social order can survive that. It just won't. But that, of course, is fairly far in the future and a little bit difficult to get people's minds around, and also can, in certain circumstances, produce a kind of paralysed despair. But I think what we need to recognise is that in the short to medium term, partly because of its direct effects, but also by feeding into and exacerbating a range of other problems, climate change can greatly contribute to the threats to existing political orders. Now, this would not have mattered nearly so much in the West a generation ago, because our liberal democratic political orders then seemed to be very strong and stable. They do not look so strong and stable today, and there is a real question just how many more or more intensified shocks they can stand up to. But go back to the debate about the Copenhagen School and securitization. Should climate change and these other issues, threats to food supply, migration, should they be defined as security threats? And also, if they are they in fact radically new security threats? Well, insofar as one is talking here about the threats to the political stability of the West and to our democratic political orders, I think it's useful to step back in time and also step outside the West. Because if you look at the broader sweep of history, I think it's fair to say that we didn't call them security establishments then, we just called them armies. But most armies in most states for most of history have been deeply concerned with questions of internal security. They've spent a great part of their time defending the state against internal unrest, internal rebellions, or of course just fighting banditry in the days when there was no real distinction between armies and policemen. And of course this is also very much true of the British Army. Not just, obviously, in the British Empire, but of course in that part of Britain or of the Empire, depending which aspect you're looking at it from, which is called Northern Ireland. I would hardly need to remind a British military audience that more British soldiers died in the Northern Irish conflict, essentially suppressing a rebellion, if you will, than died in the Falklands, the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War put together. An issue of internal security. And of course, long before 9/11, combating terrorism by British citizens was a key part of the role of our intelligence services. In the context of the coronavirus and the threat of the greatly increased spread of infectious disease in future as a result of climate change, Well, the state of plague, as it was once defined, and it was part of French law and that of other states, was in effect a kind of martial law. And similar to martial law you get in the wake of natural disasters, of course that was also intended not just to enforce quarantine, but also to prevent a breakdown of social order, looting, and so forth. If one's looking at control, flood control, then, of course, in Britain this has not been a great issue, certainly not for the military. But if you look at the United States, for example, from its very creation, the US Army Corps of Engineers has been tasked with the lead role in flood control, not just in short-term responses to floods, but to building the infrastructure to contain and prevent flooding. From this point of view, I must say I find the Chinese experience quite interesting. The legendary third emperor of China, who probably did exist, given his rather specific role 3,500 years ago, the Emperor Yu, is not famous in legend for the usual things. He's not famous for great military conquests, and he's not famous as a lawgiver, as some other great founding state figures are. He is famous for creating the Chinese system of river management and flood control. He was the guy who, according to legend, invented the dikes and the canals to manage the Yellow River. What I think the Chinese long historical experience also shows, and I believe that this is of some significance in shaping the rather specific Chinese attitude to these issues, is that throughout history, floods, failure to control floods, failure to alleviate the results of natural disasters in terms of famine, was a classic reason to think that the dynasty concerned had lost legitimacy, or in the old Chinese phrase, the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven did not just depend, as elsewhere, on defeating foreign enemies, it depended on managing the rivers. Now, why is, however, the military, specifically the military, so important when it comes to defining security issues? Well, here it must be said that part of the book is more specifically directed to the United States, because it's bigger, and because, obviously, we have a much bigger problem there with outright denial of climate change. And a key problem among Republicans in the United States, and I've had considerable experience of this myself, as you can well imagine, is that denial of climate change has moved outside the realm of evidence and argument, it seems to me, and it has become a cultural marker. I don't believe in climate change because I'm a Republican, a conservative. Democrats and liberals believe in climate change, therefore I don't. Just as they believe in gun control, therefore I don't. They don't believe in religion, or at least that's what I think, whereas I do. It's become part of this cultural identity. And as has been written by so many people in the context of climate change, by Lord Stern, for example, it is critically important when trying to reach out to particular audiences to find spokespeople and an audience which can, if you like, hit the keys on their piano, which can appeal to them within their cultural context in terms of the things that they take seriously. And I think, given the scale of the changes that will be necessary, and also, let's face it, the inevitable pain of much of this process, sacrifices undoubtedly will be necessary. And these sacrifices, if you look at a whole range of votes and protests across the West in recent years, electorates so far, in general, majorities of them have not been prepared, on the whole, to make those sacrifices. When carbon tax, for example, is put directly to a vote. So it isn't enough, in my view, simply, in America, to win 51% of a presidential election, and then try to implement a programme of reform. Or in Europe, put together a parliamentary coalition, say, which will have this agenda. It is necessary to create the kind of new dispensation, as it's been called in America, which supported the old New Deal of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and which then supported the Reagan consensus, if you like, thereafter. Because, of course, the striking thing about that is, if you look at the policies of Eisenhower in the 50s, even Nixon in the late 60s and 70s, these were New Deal Republicans. They had accepted the terms of the New Deal. Eisenhower, absolutely critical about this, absolutely categorical about this. You cannot go against the New Deal. By the way, I don't want to, but even if I wanted to, I wouldn't do it, because this is now the national consensus. Same thing as we know after the Reagan Revolution, or call it what you will, the Reagan-Thatcher change. For a generation, Clinton in America, Blair in Britain, Obama in America, governed, in effect, as Reagan Democrats. Eisenhower's granddaughter once said to me that she was voting for Obama because Obama was an Eisenhower Republican, which actually, when you think about it, is pretty much exactly what he was. So, it is necessary, I believe, to win over a lot of these unconvinced people and create this new consensus. And here, the ability of the military and security establishments to define climate change as a threat to national security, national interests, and ultimately, if unchecked, even to national survival in the long term, seems to me potentially, hopefully at least, a critical part of what I view as this necessary appeal. And that, of course, in turn relates to what I see as a critical potential contribution of nationalism in general to the call for sacrifice in the struggle against climate change. Because, as has been pointed out again and again, a critical problem in this regard is that you are asking people today to make real sacrifices to stop bad effects, the worst effects of which will only kick in after we're dead, possibly even after our children are dead. And this has led a number of people, especially, of course, economists, into what I regard as somewhat surreal and certainly deeply morally disagreeable and decadent attempts to assess mathematically the discounting of interest today against those of future generations, and vice versa, resulting in outcomes whereby the interests of our grandchildren are 1/16 of those of us today, or according to other calculations, actually 1/200th or 300th. I think it's worth pointing out, I mean, future generations would have said that this attitude to life was deeply immoral, verging on the evil. Now, of course, the whole point about a nation is something that exists in time. The notion of a nation existing for a year or so is of course, a ridiculous one. The whole point is it's existed for at least a considerable time in the past, or people believe that it has. Whether this is true or not is in a way irrelevant, especially whether people believe it. And the assumption is that it will continue to exist in future. And militaries, of course, more specifically, are not there simply to defend the interests of the nation this week. They are there to preserve the nation for the future. That is their duty, that is their role. And as I often point out, whatever the attitudes of, I mustn't say young people, that's completely unfair, given that actually it's young people who are leading this struggle. But the Great Seal of the United States does not read, the US Constitution is so last week or 10 minutes ago. It reads Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order for the ages. In other words, US civic nationalism, based around the US Constitution and what it represents, is meant to be around for a very long time, and of course to shape the world for a very long time. And that is what soldiers and security establishments are meant to commit themselves to and defend. So, the capacity not just to inspire sacrifice, but to inspire sacrifice for future generations. Incidentally, I've already, as you can imagine, been attacked several times for saying that this attitude to action against climate change involves advocating a sort of a selfish, egotistical national policy of beggar my neighbour. But that is, of course, completely ridiculous. This is fundamentally about reducing carbon emissions, our carbon emissions. That is the best thing that we can do to help other countries around the world, and especially, of course, those countries most endangered by climate change. Bangladesh, Pakistan, for example. So, national action to reduce carbon emissions is our contribution to the world in general, as well as obviously helping ourselves. Now, briefly, because I'm running out of time, there have, of course, been declarations by security establishments, by military establishments, and there are, particular security institutions, including the IISS, which emphasises this. But I think it's fair to say that these, although sometimes strongly worded, have not really amounted to making this the central priority. And I do not, I'm sure I need to remind this audience, but I very often had to remind people in Washington. You'd have people saying, the United States has 10 priorities in dealing with China. The United States has 12 priorities in dealing with Russia. And I would gently point out, I don't think you've understood what priority means. It means something comes first. That, by definition, means that other things come second or third or fourth. And what I think has happened is that, for example, James Woolsey, former head of the CIA, very strong statement in 2008 in this book and also in one or two speeches about climate change as the greatest security threat to the United States. In terms, once again, of all the other dangers and threats that it could exacerbate: migration, collapse of allies, breakdown of domestic political consensus and order. But I have to say, in the 12 years since then, what has he spent the overwhelming majority of his time talking about? The Chinese threat, the Russian threat. Climate change has simply been obliterated, it seems, from his agenda. Well, once again, if something comes first, something else comes second. Now, from this point of view, speaking as a historian, which is what I was trained as, I think it is quite useful to look back into our own history of security issues, and then to look forward, to look back 120 years or so, and then try to project ourselves forward into the shoes of our descendants and historians, sometime in the next century. Now, if you look back, especially in the generation before the First World War, it is pretty obvious that the security issues that obsessed security establishments, regimes in Europe at that time. Well, if you take Britain, in more specific cases, the rivalry with France over Central Africa, summed up in the Fashoda crisis of 1898, I think. It's not just that today the idea of the possibility, at least this is what many security analysts and journalists were screaming at the time, of war between Britain and France over southern Sudan seems just a little bit bizarre, yeah? But of course, how many years? 6 years after the Fashoda crisis, that issue was simply swept off the table when Britain recognised the rise of Germany as the principal security threat. the rivalries with France vanished, African rivalries. They were seen for what they in fact always had been, insignificant. But a more striking case, and sometimes I've never actually done it, but it could happen, that if I ever have to hear the phrase great game again for Afghanistan or what's going on in that region, I will sink my teeth into somebody's leg. It's one of these dreadful, overused cliches. But of course, even at the time, so much attention. I mean, a couple of good novels and short stories and things were devoted to this. But when Britain came to see Germany as the principal threat, basically the British security establishment came to the view, which by the way had already been expressed by Lord Salisbury, who was no softy when it came to national security issues, that the alleged Russian threat to India via Afghanistan was all the product of generals using maps with too small a scale. In other words, this was never a real issue, and when a true priority emerged, it was solved in terms of dividing up spheres of influence with remarkable ease. But of course, more widely, and more tragically, the general rivalry of the great powers in Europe turned out, leading to the First World War, turned out to be catastrophically mistaken when compared to the true threats, not just to European civilization in general, but to the regimes themselves from internal collapse and internal revolution, which was, of course, enabled by the First World War. Now, project yourself forward a century or so from now, and ask yourself about some of the issues that obsess American security establishment in particular, but to some extent ours as well, insofar as we're dragged along in its wake. The Chinese fortification of reefs and sandbanks in the South China Sea. Well, that is very likely indeed probable, even given the climate change which is by now bound to occur, to be seen as completely irrelevant and insignificant, because by then they will be underwater again. This issue will have ceased to exist in the long term. Frankly, the Chinese and the Americans might just as well throw their money into the sea and spare us all the intervening shouting and fuss. But Eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, that's a different matter, because of course ethnic issues and conflicts are involved there. But I'm sure that some historian a century or so from now will point out that if one's looking at the Donbass as an economic issue or asset, well, of course the principal resource of the Donbass is coal, which we should be giving up anyway. But also, I really do think it shouldn't... I think we can see, given the threat of climate change and associated things which are undermining our systems, it is extremely unlikely that a historian 100 years from now will see the issue of control over Crimea or eastern Ukraine as the biggest threat facing us today. It is not insignificant, but it is not the top priority, or at least they will see it that way, and I think we can see it the same. So, to conclude, in my view, all of us involved in the security studies field have to strongly and repeatedly define climate change and associated threats like mass migration as the preeminent and, in the long term, potentially existential danger to our nations in the long run and to our political systems in the short to medium term, and redeploy our national resources and, perhaps equally importantly, our national attention accordingly. And some countries, of course, are well accustomed to this. Holland is the classic example. Holland, sea defences have always been seen as central to the very existence of the state in terms of much of its land. And in future, we all stand a very good chance of becoming Holland. And I'm reminded in that regard what was supposed, I think truly, to have been the old motto of the people of Romney Marsh on the southern English coast. Serve God, honour the king, but first maintain the dike. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anatol. That was super interesting. I very much agree with your conclusions, and I think there should be a refocus in thinking of climate change in a different way and really building up a resilience towards it. But based on what you said earlier on in your presentation, the fact that the science is already out there and it now becomes more like ideological issue that is divorced from the reality, the facts, the evidence. So how optimistic are you that actually there will be this shift, and what do you think it will take for that shift to happen?
Well, Lenin or Gramsci? People with whose political and economic ideology you understand I do not agree, but they had some good quotes. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. In other words, we cannot... I really do think that as citizens, as educated citizens, educated human beings, and as parents, those of us who are, we do not have the moral right simply to give up. The odds are very great, but, hence, sort of appeals to the posters of the Second World War and so forth. I think we have to try. And if, indeed, this is such a very serious issue, then we need to think very seriously about what political means will enable us to take sufficient action. As I say, and this is partly directed to the United States, but other places as well, it does seem to me that defining it as a question of national security gives us the possibility, at least, of reaching sections of the electorate who so far have been resistant to this argument and appeal.
Thank you. Well, a number of people have already registered their interest in asking questions. Just give me a second. Just wait for me to call on you, and before you give your intervention, please introduce yourself. Pierre first.
Pierre Noël. I'm the energy person here at IISS. Pleasure to have you, Anatol, within our awards. I agree with half of the fundamental argument, and I think I disagree with the other half. The part that I strongly agree with is that the climate problem and our inability to address it just illustrates the massive problem that our countries now have with legitimacy of public action. I can't make long statements. Let's just keep it with that. And yeah. This is a very strong aspect of your book, and I strongly agree with that as a problem, and thinking about this is crucial. This has to do with postmodernity and a lot of cultural trends. Now, I think that I agree as well with the centrality of the US, but I would say the US and China.
Oh, of course.
Into addressing this problem. Everybody else is basically, irrelevant. Will follow if the US and China lead, and will do nothing if they don't, or will do nothing meaningful if they don't. Now, this is where I disagree with you. I think, unfortunately, there is a security construct now between the US and China that is not going to go away, that if anything will solidify, that makes it unlikely actually that either of them will do anything really strong about climate change. Take the US example, 700 billion plus per year spent on the military. You would have to divert a significant proportion of this and allocate it to the complete, the complete change of the US infrastructure to deal with, to allow a low carbon economy to. Of course, you would only do that if you had no strategic threat to deal with. But precisely, they have now built China as a strategic threat. So to go straight to the bottom of your argument, okay, let's assume that the US can, on their own, address meaningfully the global climate change problem. Once they have, they will wake up in a world, and the first question they will ask is, are we still the dominant global power? Or is it China? And just contemplate answering negatively to this question. So, yeah, here you go. Legitimacy is a massive issue, legitimacy of public action, but security is actually a hurdle to addressing climate change.
Shall we take a group of
yes,
three? Because
sure.
I know that lots of people have questions. So the next is Eleanor.
Thank you so much. I'm Eleanor Beaver, Research Associate at IISS. This sort of follows on neatly from Pierre's question, but going in a different direction. I'm thoroughly convinced by your thesis that we need to sort of bridge the cultural denial around climate change, if you like. We need to be appealing concepts of the sort of quote-unquote sacred, so nationhood, identity and sacrifice and so on. What I can't quite tell is if your argument is about social change or political change. And so given the title of your book, I assume you see the nation state as the sort of primary vector through which this social change has to happen. But given the sort of rise of anti-establishment parties we're seeing at a pretty unprecedented rate, and as Pierre pointed out, the decline of legitimacy in much of Western governance, is the state the right vector for what seems to me to be a social change?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Emil.
Emil Khaim, I'm the Middle East analyst here
Hi.
at the ISS. Hi. Just first a quick comment. In '97, I entered a high school laureate competition in the French system called Concours Général. Pierre would know about this. And the question was, est-ce que les générations futures ont-elles des droits? Do future generations have rights? And the corollary was, are there obligations on us at the time? And I remember reading, it's very relevant to the topic of your talk today, but it was quite striking when we saw the copies that actually had the highest grades. The issue of environment and so were actually quite secondary. At the time, it was mostly defined in terms of resources and government as also. I'm wondering if that features at all in your thinking as well. But my question, briefly, the first one is, how do you feel about the whole rhetoric now that what is needed to deal with the challenge is a warlike mentality? That you often hear people say this requires a World War II kind of effort. Is that rhetoric, is that framing helpful in terms of mobilizing it? And the second one that is linked to what Eleanor just said is, I think there's also a tension here, is that if the nation state is in the lead, it will probably create a lot more tensions with other nations. If you build your mobilization around that, to what extent does it complicate international cooperation? If suddenly you have to supercharge, the nationalism to deal with some of those issues.
Thanks.
Pierre, I'm afraid you may well be right. Just two slightly more hopeful things. One is in China, but also perhaps even more strikingly in India, the way in which a desire to reduce dependence on oil and gas imports in particular is of course also seen as an issue of national security. Now, this is not in itself about climate change. It's about the potential insecurity of their sea lanes and potential for disruption or blockade. But of course, it can also feed usefully into the struggle against climate change. If you look, for example, at the Chinese move, a pretty determined one, it appears, to try to move to electric cars over the next generation. So there can be a sort of positive coming together here. In the United States, there has been an attempt, we have to see, of course, who wins the election, and what role this, but to link the idea of a Green New Deal to technological competition with China. The phrase "the Sputnik moment" is often used. In other words, through their concentration on developing technologies of alternative energy, this is part, and it is, part of the Chinese strategy to position themselves as the leading economic and technological world power of the future. And if we are not to be basically relegated to an undeveloped, late industrial, outworn economy and society, we need to compete in these terms. So I think, as I say, I'm afraid you may be right, but I think there are certain possibilities there. Now, on the question of the rise of social, ideological, intellectual, transnational or international movements, nothing I say or write should be taken as a criticism of those movements or saying that they're irrelevant or that they shouldn't exist. I'm very grateful, even though she can be a little bit irritating sometimes, but anyway, I won't go into that. Teenagers. Greta Thunberg, I'm very glad she's there and she's creating attention. But
we don't believe you.
You can believe me. I'm completely sincere on this. But it has to be said that and international agreements as well. I am 100% behind the Paris Agreement, as I was behind previous attempts to gain agreement. But what we have to recognise is that these movements and these agreements are intended to get states to act. The agreements themselves can achieve nothing. They can't do anything. The movements, they are there to mobilise opinion, but the opinion then has to get governments to act through states. There is no international institution which can force people in a given state to pay higher carbon taxes, or can, through legislation, move them from existing automobiles to electric cars, or can build public transport systems. These are all the role of the state and cannot possibly be the role of anybody else. Now, of course, international aid and bodies like the Asia Development Bank can help in this regard, but in the end it's states who are going to be doing the work. And so, in the end, one comes around in a circle to the question of how can we motivate states and the population of states to take the action necessary. As I say, I am entirely in favour of all the movements which are trying to achieve this. But the melancholy fact of the matter is that so far they have failed to gain sufficient action. And of course, in so many cases, the countries which have signed up to these agreements, like Paris, have not in fact fulfilled their promises. We need to work out how to get them to do so. And, I referred to the fact... the difficulty of actually getting people to make sacrifices. There have been so many examples of this. But, California is often seen, and rightly in certain respects, as the leader among American states of action against climate change. But any of you ever tried to take the train between San Francisco and Los Angeles? No, you can't do it. Any train, let alone a high-speed train. Why? Well, because, obviously the federal government won't give the money, the banks won't lend the money because the profits will only come in the long term. But it's also because a majority of voters in California passed these measures radically restricting the ability of the state of California to raise revenue. They don't have the money because they couldn't raise the taxes. And taxes, I'm afraid, in one form or another, are going to be critical for doing anything. And taxes, of course, are raised by states. So we have to find out a way in which states can persuade their people to pay higher taxes. Not easy, but is the rhetoric helpful? Well, as I say, if there are certain concerns, of course, that when it comes to building national resilience or responding to the climate change, which to some extent is bound, well, it's happening already, it can't be completely stopped. There is this risk, of course, of countries basically trying to isolate themselves and build defences. But as I said in my remarks, if it's a question of getting countries to reduce carbon emissions, that is not a beggar my neighbour policy. A country which does that helps everybody. And if that involves competitive economic advantage in terms of building alternative energy technology, well, that's absolutely fair enough. I mean, that is legitimate national competition. So I don't think you see that on the issue of reducing carbon emissions that there is any conflict there, myself.
Cool, thanks. Ewan?
Thank you very much. Ewan Grant, former law enforcement intelligence analyst covering the ex-Soviet states. I was very interested in your comment about at the start about the value of the military, because they deal in contingencies and probabilities and capabilities. I've seen firsthand international law enforcement failure to recognise that, which leads they don't deal with the consequences in time developments coming out of what you're talking about. My question is, you mentioned China's work on electrification of cars and the impetus there. Do you have any comments about the geopolitics of the key raw materials supplies there, and whether there is a need for a plan B relating to hydrogen power vehicles? Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, Peter Asprey, member of the Institute. You seem to be suggesting that in order to acquire the agency to deal with this growing crisis, you need at least some enlightened, organised nation states to think and take a lead. And one would like to think that the UK might be one of those, or might be as good a candidate as any to take that kind of role. But my question really is about how to achieve that, because it seems to me that the dominant sort of progressive mindset of our nation, the leaders who set themselves up as evolved progressive people, are much more likely to be people who might stand at an extinction rally and say we should do this and that, are more likely than not to be people who are very hostile towards this idea of nation state, and who won't lead on the kind of ideas that you're putting forward. In fact, will actively work against them.
Yep.
Thanks. And in the first row, sir.
Nick Gowing with the Thinking the Unthinkable project, all deference to Herman Kahn. But we've actually retitled our project Thinking the Unpalatable.
Yeah.
That's where you
Absolutely.
are. And that's where we are, that's where you are. 2 or 3 years ago, your argument would have been seen as unhinged and slightly marginal and nice to listen to and rather quaint. Now it's centre stage. But I would suggest it is now existential, what you're saying. But there remains a danger of denial, certainly in governments, and certainly understatement as well. And I would suggest to you language is vital, and I'm suggesting you might even want to reprint your cover. Because actually talking about climate change is kind of dull. This is a climate emergency, and emergency equals security.
Absolutely.
And, therefore, in some ways your book should be the climate emergency and national survival, as opposed to just the nation state. Interesting having a conversation with Mark Sedwell, the cabinet secretary here a few months ago. He's also, of course, national security advisor. And I said you should really be relabeled or re-tagged as national stability advisor because of this new challenge. One final point, and this is my question. I am interested in your faith in states, because having been at COP25 in Madrid, states are diverging on this, and the chances in Glasgow are remote and getting remoter, simply because of the politics, the geopolitics and everything else. And what is fascinating, certainly having been in Davos and seen COP25 and seen people like the World Resources Institute and others, is that corporates are now getting well ahead of states. And therefore it may not be the nation state. We can talk about decarbonisation and zero emissions by 2050 and so on, but actually it appears to be, not all, but some sectors and a small percentage are moving very quickly in the corporate sector and acting as, if you like, leading lights as opposed to nations.
That's a very important point. And I suppose, that leads to a key question. In history as well, the balance between the ability of capitalism to regulate and reform itself, in part through enlightened leaders, as you describe, and the need for state intervention. And of course here, because of the existential nature of the crisis in the long term, we are dealing with something a bit different. But I think one can frame this in terms of the creation of the welfare state from the later 19th century, and indeed previous measures as well, in Britain and elsewhere to improve conditions of labour, which either more enlightened or, of course, more ethical, more Christian in those days, industrialists themselves pushed and signed up to. But at least I would say that the argument of history is that that has rarely been enough. I mean, historically speaking, states have had to be involved as well. That there have been too many capitalists who have basically... I mean, of course, the reason, the enlightened self-interest reason for the creation of welfare states was to prevent communist revolution. And states which failed to introduce such systems, well, by God, they suffered communist revolution. So, I mean, I think what I say in the book is that the whole idea of a Green New Deal and, you know, associated measures to reshape the economy and control carbon emissions has to be seen as another stage in the long effort to save capitalism from itself. And the book, as you can imagine, is pretty damn critical of people like Naomi Klein and so forth, who basically think that you have to destroy capitalism in order to control carbon emissions, because if that's true, it isn't going to happen. I mean, of course, in the long term, capitalism may well be destroyed along with everything else, but it will take our civilization down with it. This action has to take place through a reformed capitalism, and I would certainly say that you know, I very much appreciate and understand and support, you know, actions by you know, by leading capitalists, corporations, but I think state intervention will be critical. And on, I mean, faith in states, I don't have much faith in anything much anymore, I have to say, in international affairs. But I would tend to say that states aren't the only thing we've got when it comes to taking action, but they are the most important thing we've got. And of course, although this book is directed chiefly to Western audiences, there are sections on China, India, and Russia, where, of course, it will most definitely be the state that takes the lead, if anyone does. Yes, I mean, I know, I have experienced this, as you can imagine. And it is very difficult, but all one can do, I think, is two things. One, point out that, yet again, in the end, what all these international and internationalist movements are trying to do is they're trying to get states to act. You know, and certainly so many of the people with the views you have described would have little faith in a corporate-led response to this, in which they may be wrong, of course, to some extent, but there is. Look, I don't know. An dear American friend, Ambassador Bill Maines, who some of you may have known later, Bill Maines, he once said, "Anatole, you have every qualification to work in the policy world of Washington, D.C., except one. You still believe in the Enlightenment. In other words, you still believe in the power of reasoned argument and evidence and so forth. Well, you know, one has to go on trying, right? You know, the point here is that there, once again, I mean, that there is no international body which can actually take the action required. It's states have to do it. And when you're talking about carbon taxes and so forth, there isn't anything else. So, because otherwise, you are engaging in fantasies. I mean, even in Washington, let alone in Beijing or Moscow or Delhi, the idea of these governments and these political elites surrendering key aspects of national sovereignty to some international body. It's a joke. It's fantastical. Thinking in these terms, you might as well dream that we're going to be rescued by people from Jupiter for all the good it does. The other thing, though, I would say is, and I emphasise this quite strongly because one section of the book talks about the origins of the British welfare state, the Beveridge Report in the Second World War, in what was then called national efficiency or social imperialism thinking before the First World War, on the part actually, certain conservatives, military characters, Field Marshal Lord Roberts, but also people on the left, or kind of like Webbs and Shaw and so forth, about the need to strengthen social solidarity as part of building the resilience and toughness of the country in the face of the possibility, as it turned out, the actuality of war. And I point out how in Britain, but to some extent elsewhere as well, the creation of the modern welfare state was a patriotic social democratic policy. And this idea that by, if you talk about the need for civic nationalism or patriotism, to give it another name, you are thereby automatically somehow on a road which leads to fascism. That is frankly very reminiscent of the right-wingers in America who say, if you talk about social democratic solutions or state intervention in any way, well, the next thing you'll be is a communist if you aren't that already. And, I've actually got a biography of him in my bag at the moment, Major Clement Attlee was not a fascist. And the project of the British welfare state in the Second World War was not a fascist project. It was there to fight against fascism. And I do think, I think it's pretty obvious that if we can't get a grip on this complex of issues, not fascism itself, but some very, very nasty political outcomes are visibly down the line. This is not, given the results of some recent elections and what's been happening, this is not some fantastical science fiction project, idea. This is a real and visible danger in future. And as I've said many times, people who call Trump a fascist, they ain't seen nothing yet.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid we have run out of time, with apologies for those who have patiently waited to be called upon, but we ran out of time. But thank you very much, Anatole. This was a very rich discussion. Thank you all for your contribution. Sadly, we don't have copies on sale, but you can find them on Amazon and in bookstores. So good luck with the book.
Thank you.
And we look forward to reading more of your work.
Thank you so much.